Morning. I'm Sheriff Jim Allard of the Sabine County Sheriff's Office. Here with me today is District Attorney Brooks Baker and Investigator Donald Lewis. Investigator Lewis is the lead investigator on this case. Frequently when we take a DWI arrest to trial, we hear from the defense that it's a victimless crime. We know that it's not. We know that in some cases, in DWI cases, holes are left in families, friends lose friends, and we experience some of the most significant loss in a community that we'll ever experience. In the course of this investigation, I've had a chance to talk to some folks that were friends with those that we lost. I found out that one was on her way to med school and had taken the MSATs the day before this horrific crash. In interviewing a young man that was hanging out with them that evening, he said to me, "I hugged my best friend since childhood goodbye when we left the bar that night, not knowing I would never see her again." When someone dies in a crash, it affects the family. It affects the family's friends. It leaves a hole that never is the same again. And that's what we experienced a little over a week ago. All of the folks that were victims of this crash lived locally, worked locally, and were known to the first responders. As we look at the process of adjudication of DWIs in New York State, or driving while impaired, the way it typically works is that a first-time offender for a misdemeanor DWI is typically pled out to a DWAI, a violation, in hopes that they get the treatment they need to make sure that they don't reoffend. If they do reoffend and get arrested again for DWI, typically they're charged with the misdemeanor and convicted of the misdemeanor, with a loss of license and a more significant fine and more treatment required in hopes that they don't reoffend again. In the cases where they do reoffend again, they're charged as a felon in New York State with larger consequences, a longer loss of license, and a greater fine. A person who's charged with a felony DWI in New York State has already been through the system at least once, if not twice. They know the dangers of what they do, and they know the risks associated. Yesterday, Dustin W. Drake turned himself in for arrest here at the Sheriff's Office, and he was charged with 3 charges. He was charged with DWI as a felony, as having had a previous conviction of DWI within the last 10 years. He was charged with aggravated vehicular homicide with the subsection of being previously convicted of a DWI within the last 10 years. And he was charged with aggravated vehicular homicide with the subsection of multiple fatalities involved in that. Those are both Class B felonies. The DWI, felony DWI, is a Class D felony. Mr. Drake turned himself in with counsel and was released, arraigned and released, as he posed no flight risk. I can only tell you that in the course of this investigation over the past week and a half, it's necessary to keep in mind the pain to the victims' families and their friends. That's why we've kept as little out of the press, or as little from the press as we could, so that we made sure that we did a correct and complete investigation before we spoke. Mr. Drake was the operator, the only one who survived in this crash, and he was charged after significant physical evidence was processed. I would like to thank the Pulteney Volunteer Fire Company for all their help at the scene of this incident. I would like to thank the New York State Police for their assistance in this case. Having said all that, I'll now open this up to questions and let District Attorney Baker say a few words.
There's not much else I can say about this case. Having been prosecuting drunk driving cases and been to every felony and fatal case in this county for the last 25 years, this was one of the most horrific crash sites and scenes we've ever dealt with in this county. 4 young, promising lives were lost from very tight-knit communities here in Steuben County. The echoes from their loss will go out for decades. We will basically, our heart goes out to the families, and there is nothing we can do except do our jobs and respect those who were lost. We will go forward with the prosecution. At this point, the investigation is still ongoing. The Sheriff's Department, Investigator Lewis, has done a phenomenal job quarterbacking that process. We've had cooperation from the state police and also from the fire folks in Pulteney and other emergency responders. It's been a wide-ranging investigation. There has been no stone left unturned, but it will continue. The defendant was arraigned with counsel, and the case is now beginning the process of going forward. Our next step will be a grand jury presentation in the relatively near future when the rest of our evidence is in. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that I can or defer to the sheriff if I can. Yes.
Drake's alcohol level?
We don't have that as yet. We are waiting for some of those results to come in from the New York State Police Laboratory.
And is the bar Maloney's part of the investigation?
I really don't want to comment on the evidence at this point. That would be unfair to the defendant and also to our investigation.
Now, Sheriff Allen was saying that that Drake has been convicted of a DWI before. Is that true?
He is charged with driving while intoxicated as a felony. That requires a prior conviction within the past 10 years. It's also an aggravating factor under one of the vehicular homicide charges is a prior conviction. So, yes, that's true.
And you said that he turned himself in. Can you go into more detail about what led to that? Was something put out there that led him to come in?
Well, there was a conversation that was had. Investigator Lewis met with him and talked to him and had a conversation that indicated that when we would reach out to him when the time came. We did. A lawyer contacted the office and arranged for him to turn himself in for arraignment at our centralized arraignment part here yesterday afternoon. He voluntarily surrendered.
Where is he now?
He has been released on his own recognizance, so where he is wherever he is at this stage. Yes.
Have you guys planned a trial date yet?
Trial date's a long ways off at this stage. Our next step will be a grand jury presentation, which will take place hopefully the next couple of months.
Okay.
Next couple of months?
Yes.
Is there another court date prior to when that gets?
He has been adjourned to appear in the town of Pulteney Court, I believe. It's a November date. I don't have the date off the top of my head. I'm sorry, November 20th. Thank you, investigator. I'm glad one of us has that.
So you're going to appear in Pulteney Town Court November 20th?
That's correct.
Now, I know Sheriff was said the charges facing against Drake. Can you just kind of repeat those again?
Sure. The first charge is driving while intoxicated, and that alleges that he was intoxicated and has a prior conviction within 10 years and was operating a motor vehicle. And then there are 2 different versions of aggravated vehicular manslaughter. One of them, they both involve killing someone in a drunk driving accident, and one involves the aggravator of having a prior. Yes, aggravated vehicular homicide. That is I'm sorry. The old charge, new charge is aggravated vehicular homicide. Both of those require driving while intoxicated. They require reckless driving. One of them requires that he have a prior DWI conviction, this being a felony. The other involves the aggravator of having multiple fatalities, which is our situation. He fits both of those categories. So they are 2 different counts involving different elements for the same underlying conduct.
Can you go into more detail about the previous charge from years ago? Was anyone hurt in that case?
I can't go into it. 2, it's not relevant to our inquiry. The requirement here is that we prove he has a prior conviction. That's the only thing that we have to prove in this case.
Was it in Steuben County?
I don't know that right now. We're waiting for our certificate of conviction to come in.
And just, obviously a horrific scene altogether. Nobody wins in this kind of a case, but how is he doing?
You know, that really isn't my focus right now. I don't, our focus is putting together a criminal case, trying to tell the victims' families what happened as best they can, as best we can, and going forward with our investigation and putting together the criminal case. So how he's doing is really not part of our process. He appears to be physically fine.
Or cooperating with it.
Cooperation's a relative term. He appears to be physically fine.
Who's his attorney?
Ray Slaughter has indicated he will be representing him. And he appeared with him yesterday for arraignment.
What's that?
He appeared with him yesterday
Okay.
for arraignment.
Okay.
Moving forward, what are you looking to, you know, by prosecuting this, what do you hope that this, at the end of the day, will tell the victims' families?
You know, I don't know that anything we ever could do will make the victims' families feel better. I don't pretend to put myself in their shoes. What I can tell them is we will do our best to get justice for their loved ones and to find out for them exactly what happened as best we can and make sure that under the law the appropriate sanctions are imposed against the defendant. That's all the system can do, unfortunately. And that's one of the tragic and sad things about cases like this is there's no way to make anybody whole here.